It's time now for the KC Ingram Show on WSTU. The opinions expressed are those of the program host and guest and not necessarily those of WSTU. WSTU does not endorse products that may be mentioned. Any reproduction or retransmission of this broadcast is strictly prohibited without written consent of WSTU. It's time to call in with your questions and comments at 220-9788, 220-WSTU. And now, here's KC Ingram.
Good morning. This is Richard Geisinger, and I'm sitting in for KC Ingram in the KC Ingram Show. And I have the pleasure of interviewing Jim Moir this morning, who's the executive director for the Indian River Keepers organization, which is a 501c3 organization. And Jim and I have met each other before, but I'm going to ask him some questions about the organization and about his personal background and his passion. So good morning, Jim.
Good morning, Richard. How are you today?
Can you tell me a little bit about the organization first, maybe its mission, when it was formed, and where it's going?
So the Indian River Keeper is doing business as the Indian River Keeper from the parent organization, which is the Treasure Coast Environmental Defense Fund, which was originally incorporated in 2000, or I think the concept was 1999, and 2000 was when it was incorporated. A high school teacher named Kevin Stinnett up in St. Lucie County founded it. There were some discharges from the sewage treatment plants up in the middle part of the lagoon that were very concerning. And several of the sort of environmental conservationists in the St. Lucie Martin County area intended to be able to become part of the Waterkeepers Alliance and to get those sewage treatment facilities to do the right thing and stop injecting their sewage into the lagoon. Several years elapsed, and then George Jones became the Indian River Keeper, and several more years elapsed, and Marty Baum became the Indian River Keeper.
Marty, yeah.
And then several years elapsed, and then Mike Connor became the Indian River Keeper. Yeah. And then several years elapsed, and I became the Indian River Keeper. And so each one of those personalities brought a very sort of different perspective to the executive directorship of the organization. We have remained connected to the Waterkeepers Alliance, which is an international association of river and water keepers from around the world. And protecting the rights to clean water is the primary mission of those water keepers around the world.
So we had a chance to talk a little bit before the program, and we kind of talked about the history of the rivers in the United States and how they were used in the 1800s and 1900s, and how we wish we kind of didn't use them that way, the industrial pollution, et cetera. But so that we're going to be talking a lot about water today. So people often ask me, why does Florida have so many water problems? And I mean, three things come to my mind. One is that Florida is the second lowest elevation state in the United States. It has the second longest shoreline, and it's got the third biggest population. Now, you combine all those three things and recognizing that a majority of the population lives on the shore. So you have a extreme environmental impact just by us being here. I think we grew over 400,000 population in 2022. We're the fastest growing state in the United States right now. So a little history about the lake and Kissimmee, and what most of us realize. We always hear about the discharges. Let's start in the center of the state and work out towards the coast, if that's all right, okay. Jim. We also talked a little bit about how the lake got in the condition it's in, and we can talk about the hurricane, we can talk about the dike, but really talk about Lake River Kissimmee a little bit, and how that did not help us, what the Army Corps of Engineers did. Most people don't know that Kissimmee goes all the way up to Orlando. Please.
Yeah. So, I think it starts with agriculture.
Okay.
It was recognized that our climate is unique. and that it could provide a breadbasket for the United States through the winter months. And this is really before the California Central Valley had been sort of opened up. And so as Flagler moved his railroad down, the industry of citrus became sort of a leading crop industry in Florida,
Right.
and fed much of the United States. Other row crops became super important to the sort of the agricultural industry. So when the areas around the Finger Lakes and the central section of Florida, the sort of the higher elevation of Florida, were opened up to citrus, the channelization of the Kissimmee River allowed all of that topsoil that was fertilized with unnaturally large amounts of fertilizer. As the land was scraped and the scrub pine forests were removed and planted with citrus, much of that soil became legacy muck in the bottom of Lake Okeechobee.
Let me interrupt you just for a second, because maybe a lot of the listeners don't realize that the Kissimmee was an oxbow.
Yeah.
And it, from what I've been told, it took months for something to go in around the Orlando area and finally make it to the lake.
Yeah.
And then when the Army Corps of Engineers decided to straighten it out for better drainage, it became days instead of months, so that the ability to clean the water was completely dissipated. I mean, right? Anyhow, go ahead.
So the ability for the natural systems to take the nutrients out of the sediments and the storm runoff was removed. It's important for water to move slowly if it's going to be denitrified in particular. And so it has to move over vegetated areas and have those nutrients removed by the plant material. Florida's soil was super rich and muck soil, in particular south of Lake Okeechobee.
We're going to talk about that in a minute. Yeah.
And so all of those nutrients that slowly came out of the plant life in Florida, because Florida is relatively young as well. I mean, geologically, it's a young place. It also has some of the most important aquifer reserves in the country. And so Florida's moving water on the surface at a very low elevation is slow. And so the River of Grass is a very slow moving river. And the aquifer is also a very slow moving system of interconnected waterways. And so Florida has water above and below its surface. It's a very, very sublime state. And those are very important connections. And we as a species are relatively new to the state as well.
Right.
I mean, maybe as much as 14,000 years ago, there were populations of indigenous people here. And then since then, there have been other populations of indigenous species.
So 100 years ago, and people may not realize this about the history of the state, is Lake Okeechobee was really nothing more than a big wetland. I mean, that's the way that I envision it.
Sort of a bowl with a sandy bottom, not certainly filled with 8 feet of muck.
and fed with a couple rivers, one being the Kissimmee. Right. And then coming back, and the whole south side of the lake became very productive because the water flowed all the way south, all the way to the south part of the state of Florida, right?
And it
through
would
the
brim
Everglades,
over the top.
River of Grass.
Yeah.
Right.
So it would the rainy season, because we get a lot of rain in Florida. The water would brim over the top and slowly flow south because the elevation is higher here than it is in southeast Florida.
Right.
And so the Everglades were formed on this very rich peaty soil that took many hundreds of years to evolve and be deposited there. And that soil was incredibly rich and very attractive to the agricultural industry.
Well, along comes the hurricane, right?
That changed. I mean, there had been a dike created out of muck and soils that then was overtopped by the sort of the sloshing effect of a massive hurricane, which killed a lot of people.
Over 2,500
yeah.
people died in 1928, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And Pahokee was probably the center of that tragedy. The Army Corps of Engineers came in and restored the earthen dike, with a dike that performed relatively well for a long time, but it didn't have the foundation, the sort of the dam style foundation that was required to sort of keep the seepage from coming out and around it. And so after Hurricane Katrina, it was determined that they really needed to come in and spend, several $1 billion to restore that dike and to allow more storage in Lake Okeechobee.
So it changed the whole ecological component out there, because now the water is unable to travel south through the River of Grass or the Everglades, and it goes east and west through the St. Lucie Canal.
Well,
right?
and a huge agricultural interest evolved
Yeah, of
south of
course,
the
right,
lake, which as much as anything else was created with this sort of perfect irrigation system. The St. Lucie River was never connected to the Lake Okeechobee system or even the Everglades system. And it was the St. Lucie Canal built in the 20s that they actually went through the Atlantic Ridge, which was sort of the higher 28-foot ridge that separated Lake Okeechobee from the St. Lucie estuary. So we'll get to this, I think, in a little bit, about the distinction between the Indian River Lagoon and the St. Lucie estuary, and now what has become a huge watershed. We have the entire Kissimmee River Basin connected into the entire Okeechobee Lake Basin, now connected into the St. Lucie estuary and the Indian River Lagoon, which had never been connected before. And now we've also got this connections into the Loxahatchee and several other basins that were never geologically connected.
So you have a dike system that was created by Herbert Hoover, I think.
It was named after Herbert Hoover.
Named after him, right. And as a result of that dike system, you now have a available area south of the lake, which is huge in size and probably some of the most productive land, agriculturally speaking, in Florida for sure, right?
Yeah.
So it didn't take long for those interests to come in and start developing that land, and now we know it mostly is sugar growth, right? And that's a whole nother story that maybe we'll get into another time. But so now the water can't flow south, and it flows sideways. And as a result of the Kissimmee not cleaning up the water before it gets there, we've got dirty water coming in and dirty water going out. Fair. I mean, I'm just trying to keep this simple. I'm not a environmentalist.
There's a kind of important component to that, in that, when Florida evolved as a coral reef system, many thousands of years ago, there were deposits of phosphate that were laid down and then folded over as reef systems and, meteorites or asteroids landed in the Gulf of Mexico. And so these deposits were buried. And now the phosphate industry is a very big industry on the west coast of Florida. But our soils have a surplus of phosphates already embedded in them
to begin with, right?
Florida is probably the second largest exporter of phosphates in the world.
And what are phosphates used for?
Phosphates are used as a nutrient. Sort of phosphates and nitrates are the two primary nutrients that plants need to grow. They also need sunlight to photosynthesize, and that becomes glucose, which becomes sort of the fundamental basis for the food web. So they are the primary producers in our planet. They also make oxygen, which is pretty vital for we animals to survive.
Our state's got more phosphate
than it needs, and so any additional phosphate is a pollutant.
Right,
it's a surplus. And so we now also bring artificial nitrates in the form of ammonium nitrate synthesized from the oil industry into the state to grow surplus crops, which are subsidized by by your tax dollars.
Is this something that we would put on our lawn or on
Well,
our
unfortunately, we do.
Okay.
So one of the things we've done is we've taken all of the native trees and systems that were evolved to handle this sort of atmospheric deposition of nutrients, as well as what happens when plants and animals die as they naturally decompose and become nutrient fertilizer for the living plants. And now we're amending that with artificial nutrients that come from elsewhere, as well as mining the product in the west coast of Florida and putting it on our soils. And so we've got this legacy now of hundreds of years or 120 years of extra nutrients over nutrifying the soils. And so when we don't slow that runoff at all, we allow it to rush into the waterways, we suddenly get these algal blooms, which are killing our waterways and making tourism on the west coast of Florida very difficult with
So not only do we have this problem in the center of the state because of the phosphate industry itself or agriculture or whatever,
right.
We have it in our daily lives with our homes and how we fertilize our lawn and where that goes. That's what we're kind of
and how we respect our natural system versus artificially creating one that is now sort of the Florida stereotype, which is palm trees and St. Augustine grass.
So we talk a lot about trying to. I guess the Army Corps of Engineers now has been instructed to recreate the oxbow effect on the Kissimmee. I don't know how far along they are with that. Are they?
They're moving along really quite well. I think that's an example of a restoration project that has come a long way and is doing a great deal of good. Whether there's enough property around the oxbow or the reconfigured Kissimmee River in order to denitrify that surplus water,
right? You need more than the oxbow. You need surrounding land.
You don't just need to convey it. You need to absorb it.
Right.
And so, there are certainly still and probably forever too many nutrients entering the lake, and we have to figure out somehow how to manage that. I would caution the ideas of pumping that water down because untreated, already polluted water going into our aquifers is not necessarily in future generations.
I'm not a biologist or an environmentalist, although I believe in the environment heavily. I could never understand doing that, to be honest with you, but it's not my scope of work.
Well, it's a politically fraught question. I'm not sure that it's actually feasible to rely on water that is pumped into a moving system to stay in the same area for any length of time.
Doesn't seem very logical to me.
To me, it doesn't either.
So, I neglected to ask you, how did you get involved, Jim? How did you get involved with the Indian River Keepers, and what's your background?
Well, very circuitously. I studied anthropology, archaeology, and became a boat builder, and sold that company. And a friend of mine asked me if I wanted to go whaling because I had altered a shrimp boat to become a research vessel for him. And so I started putting tags on right whales and other species of whales, and somehow along the way became a facilitator for ocean science projects. And I have a young man, he's now 22. So 22 years ago, he was an infant. And I realized that this place, Martin County, I call home, and being involved in protecting my home is something that I need to do for my son and for my wife. And so I became involved in local planning issues and became an appointee of the local planning agency. And I had been involved in sort of some noise with them. Airport Action Majority was sort of the first political issue I became associated with.
Witham Field.
Witham Fields and its expansion.
Yeah.
And I grew up on Key Biscayne, which was sort of an idyllic place for a young person in the 60s to grow up. And I chose Martin County because of its very unique, very carefully protected environmental sort of stewardship. Um, and I became alarmed at sort of its slow regression from that principle. I'm still very concerned that Martin County may be moving in the wrong direction.
Yeah, it's hard to battle the growth issue, number one, but if you don't have the planning in place and their ordinances and regulations in place to handle that runoff, I mean, that's really what we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
It makes it difficult. And I think it's safe to say that one of our biggest assets, the biggest asset probably, is the river system, whether it's the St. Lucie or the Indian River. They're both important. And I mean, it's one of the reasons why my family came.
I'm a sailor. And so when I looked at charts of the southeast coast of the United States, it's almost impossible to ignore the St. Lucie estuary.
Right.
It has this magnificent shape.
Mm-hmm.
And then once you sail into the lagoon, you realize that there's actually topography here that's very unique, very different than the rest of Florida. And it's incredibly compelling. It's also, I think, what brought the early settlers here, and certainly probably brought the ice Indians here. They could look out over the waterways and identify, friend, foe, and food.
Right.
It brings people here. It's a magnet. It attracts people. It's also the reason we need to protect it so desperately. The St. Lucie estuary is, I think, still the most biodiverse estuary in North America. I don't know anybody else that can make that claim. So if we've lost diversity, which we have dramatically, it's still the treasure of the Treasure Coast.
Right.
And I think we need to embrace that, at the risk of perhaps inviting more residents here. But we have 1,100 new residents moving into the state daily. So
I think it becomes our responsibility to educate, number one, and to be responsible for what happens in our area. And I think that's what you've done. And congratulations.
We need to stand by the regulations that we have.
Right.
And in today's climate, to diminish regulations and to diminish the enforcement of those regulations seems counterintuitive at the very least, if not dangerous and wrong at worst.
Right. So I think what we're going to do is spend the second half of the hour talking about things that we can do now that we talked about the things that kind of got us in this position. But thank you, Jim. I'll see you in a couple minutes.
Excellent.
You're listening to the KC Ingram Show on WSTU Digital 1450. Call in with questions and comments at 220-9788, 220-WSTU. And now back to the show.
Hi, this is Richard Geisinger again, and I'm here with Jim Moir from the Indian River Keepers. And Jim, we talked in the first half hour about kind of how we got into this situation with our waterways and the Lake Okeechobee and the Kissimmee River and the Everglades. And it's kind of a tough conversation to have. I am a glass half full person, and I think that you are too. Where are we going from here, and what are some things that are happening that are productive on the positive side of those discussions?
I think with some honest optimism. I think that often Florida has sort of suffered from engineered solutions to natural problems or natural impediments to this desire to control. And the IRL in particular has gotten to a pretty tragic place.
It's the Indian River Lagoon.
Indian River Lagoon. Yeah, sorry about the acronyms.
It's government. Go ahead.
Yeah, the acronyms, unfortunately, I think are a little infectious.
Explain to them, first of all, where is the Indian River Lagoon?
So the Indian River Lagoon is a 156-mile shallow water lagoon between the Barrier Islands and the east coast of Florida, running from Jupiter up to Daytona.
So it's the intercoastal, basically, right?
The intercoastal and the lagoon system that evolved.
Right.
So it probably evolved over maybe 6,000 years ago as a very nutrient controlled situation. And so the plant and animal life that evolved here was incredibly diverse. It needed to take advantage of these relatively narrow niches in the ecosystem. And it was dominated by seagrass as a producer, as well as some macroalgae that are attached algae, as opposed to the free-floating phytoplankton that has now become a dominant problem in the lagoon, in that it feeds on excess nutrients, blooms, and then dies, and then the microbes consume that, generating more nutrients, and this sort of bloom and bust cycle,
which we've experienced,
which is killing the seagrasses.
Yeah.
And so we need to reduce the nutrient inputs, and there are programs, state funded and federally mandated, that are working to reduce those inputs. Probably not fast enough, but we have improving water quality, but we continue to see the habitat failing. And so we've had, a couple thousand manatee die because they starved to death, because the seagrasses were gone. And these inspire us to do something more. And so there's probably going to be maybe $100,000 an acre spent on restoring seagrasses to the Indian River Lagoon.
How do we keep those seagrasses alive, Jim? It's
going to be a real challenge, because we first have to keep them from being consumed by the manatees and green sea turtles that are left.
So sewer discharges, though.
Sewer discharges are a major issue.
Okay.
And so, the governor is proposing about $100 million a year for the next 4 years to do turn dirt projects.
Give us an example of that.
So an example would be septic to sewer conversions, which would be, an obvious
getting people off of septic tanks onto sewer,
sewer,
especially
systems
along the intercoastal Indian River, right?
Yeah, I mean, the basin is an important piece of this, and so, as we mentioned in the last half hour, the basin has been enlarged by several 100%. The normal drainage basin for the lagoon and for the St. Lucie estuary was much, much smaller, maybe 900 square miles, as opposed to maybe 1 million miles.
And how did that expand? I'm not sure.
By connecting these canals into these systems that are farther inland, we are now draining those further inland systems in your neighborhood, for instance, has a drainage ditch that's now connected to the lagoon. So anything you put on your yard, or anything that was on your yard before your house, is now going to relatively unobstructedly flow into the lagoon. And so everything we do in our urbanized developments is now influencing a system that did not evolve to accommodate that. And that's the real challenge, is how do we have low impact development that manages its own stormwater systems within its own footprint and not increasing the load into a system that can't handle it.
It seems in the last 20 years, though, just to again look at the glass half full, is that any development I know in Martin County or Stewart that would have been approved would have had on-site water retainage,
Right.
and unfortunately in storm events, everything that's in there goes out. Right.
Well, this is the monster problem that Florida faces, and unfortunately, this legislature isn't doing a lot to make that better. I mean, I think that home rule is under attack. And I think that there are several bills out there that are directly going to negatively affect the way we handle wetlands.
Let's talk about that for a second. We didn't talk about this.
Right. Well, I think it's important because this, all of these things are political.
But why would the state of Florida want to take over what I would call a local, either in our area, Martin County, City of Stewart, municipal control over us wanting to protect our wetlands? Let's just say that for a second. I mean, why would they want to have, it would seem to me that they would want to applaud local municipalities for taking care of water management instead of, am I looking at it wrong?
I think I think that there is a very magnetic attraction to developing Florida.
Yeah, but not that way. I mean, it becomes communities that you don't want to live in, right?
Well, that's sort of what we're getting, right? And I think the thing that drew me to Martin County, many years ago was these controls on growth, and
height limitations,
and a comp plan that had
open
some teeth,
spaces,
right, and an urban service boundary that made sense, and that was confining rather than allowing sort of explosive development,
sprawl. Right.
And I think, we used to compare Martin County to other counties around us, and now it's very difficult to draw that distinction. We still are better than many, but we're losing ground, and we're losing ground partly because of the state legislature.
So get back, because I still don't understand why the state would want to tell, for example, Martin County how to control water management. I mean, unless they were going to increase the restrictions instead of decrease them, why would they want to do that? Because are you saying because they?
Well, there's a couple of reasons. One is that development has a very large outsized voice in the Florida legislature. Agriculture has a very outsized voice in the Florida legislature. The ability to control the nutrient inputs is based on basin management action plans, which come now under Florida Department of Environmental Protection rather than the federal DEP control. And so, under the guise of property rights, we have now sort of de-emphasized local planning and comp plan creation in order to bring it under sort of a state control. And now those municipalities that had very strong growth management protections in place are now going to be required to mediocritize those into something that is more state controlled rather than locally controlled.
Well, we were both here when the comp plan got adopted, I think.
I came just afterwards. Yeah, in '92 was my.
It was a scary document,
Yeah.
But in the long run, it seemed to be a very good planning tool for everyone because it was introduced as this is the way that we're going to grow. This is how we're going to protect our county, right? So I'm a little concerned, as you are, that the state wants to take away some of those rights that made us different. The reason why we both moved here, right? Again, if they were going to make them stricter, I would kind of understand that a little bit, maybe more, but they're not. It doesn't seem like it.
No.
They're going to make them less,
Yeah.
right? Less restrictive. So that means more pollutants going into the river. It means a diminishing of the quality of life. I mean, am I
I
seeing that wrong?
I see it the way you do, and it concerns me and bothers me a great deal.
So at the end of our conversation, we're going to give the listeners some direction as to where they can go to, help this
Yeah.
cause. But right now, this is a state legislature thing, and
Yes.
they're debating this bill right now, from what I
Well,
understand.
there's several bills that
Yep.
are really not good at all. There are some bills that are
Right.
really quite good.
Right.
Just to go down the list,
Please. Yeah.
SB 1632, which is partnered by House Bill 1379, is a positive bill. It says there are no septic tanks going to be permitted in the BMAP basins.
Okay.
BMAP are Basin Management Action Plans, and
what would
the
that
new
mean?
acronym for septic tank is
if I was 2 miles
OSTD.
off the coast and I'm in a community has septic tanks, they're going to
Right.
try and
You're not under this bill. You wouldn't be permitted to build a
develop that.
new
I see.
septic tank.
Okay.
There's also some proposals to re-inspect them. I mean, that was one of the things that blew my mind was, how could you not inspect a septic tank?
If it didn't work, it didn't work, right?
So there's another one that's positive, which is SB 172, partnered by House Bill 177. And it's you have the right to swim in non-polluted water. So if there are going to be blue-green algae risks, you would be cautioned about swimming in that water, which I think is a positive thing.
It'd be more positive if they stop
if they stop the
right.
Yeah, if they prevented blue-green algae, if they actually follow the recommendations of the Blue-Green Algae Task Force. That was a very intentionally created task force. I think only 2 of the recommendations have actually been followed through.
Yeah.
Senate Bill 1686, which is partnered with House Bill 1489, is the barrier islands of critical concern. So constructing on the barrier islands in areas of critical concern and those places that are naturally and scenic or federally protected is going to be limited. So some really bad bills are SB 1240, which is partnered by House Bill 1197, which is this diminishing of isolated wetlands and basically reducing the protections on wetlands. And Martin County has been very clear that even the smallest isolated wetlands have a very important ecological function, and you should not, and in Martin County would not be permitted to build or to damage a wetland.
So in other words, the state's basically saying if the wetland is a very slight nature, let's say it's a half acre or something like that, and you have a 10-acre site,
that's not clear.
Yeah.
I mean, it could be a highly connected and functioning wetland that might be influenced
but
by
they're
this
taking
bill
that right away from
the local municipality to protect it.
Right.
Which
again, I have to go back to my question: why would they want to do that? And your answer is a scary one.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the development interests are very powerful in this state, and I think that sometimes in this effort to create more property rights, the state is going down a very dangerous pathway of deregulating and diminishing the ability to enforce any regulations that exist.
I mean, at some point in time, the state's got to recognize that if we're the fastest growing state in the United States, we can't continue to do that forever.
We have to control the natural resources that we have, and we have to value them at the highest level we can.
Right.
So another one is SB 540, partnered by House Bill 359, which basically reduces a municipality or an individual's right to sue a development order that comes through that that you are intending to challenge a comp plan amendment over, and that would allow the plaintiff to get full legal costs. So if you were to sue a developer for changing or for amending a comp plan, as is happening in Martin County currently, they could countersue you for their legal expense,
Right.
which
kind of takes away the
right
incentive
of a citizen to
right.
defend their comp plan.
Right.
Takes the right of a municipality to stand in front of a developer because they're intimidated from bringing legal action against them.
So as always, it's a balance between property rights and the environment and those
Well,
things. And interesting, those things should be able to work together when you start talking about quality of life. That's the part that's kind of left out of the conversation.
Well, the crazy thing
Right.
is that somehow corporate rights exceed property rights, exceed individual rights, and exceed the rights of nature. I mean, one of the very important things that we're losing is the rights of the natural systems to have clean water. And I think the petition that's going around right now, which is the rights to clean water, is very important for us. And it may be driving some of the concern that people have in the state legislature about, what happens if the rights to clean water is adopted.
Talk about that just for a second.
So it would provide citizens to sue either the municipality, the state, or the agency, or the polluter for polluting your water, which seems like a fundamental right. I mean, if somebody pollutes your water, they should be held accountable for that.
It's trying to the difficult part is finding out who
well, I mean,
who is the
for a
culprit, right?
non-point source, it might be.
Right.
But if it's the agency that permits that, then that's a clear
violation of
your
right.
rights and your protection.
Clean air, clean water. Right.
And I think, we in the St. Lucie estuary suffer dramatically from the Army Corps' transport authority to move polluted waters from one polluted water body into another impaired water body.
Right.
My personal feeling is that if we created a national park that protected the entire Indian River Lagoon and the nearshore reef, then we would refederalize the authority of clean water, take it away from the state's control, which has been pretty inefficient, and give it to the EPA, so that the EPA would have, federal matching authority over what is happening to the IRL, and it would give the municipalities some breathing room. And they certainly have a lot more money and enforcement capacity.
What would that look like, Jim? Just talk about that for a second. If that were to happen, what would when you say park?
So there are national seashores. Merritt Island is a federally protected area. The Pelican Island Reserve is the oldest sanctuary in the country. So they exist in the IRL. I think a marine protected area that covered the nearshore reef, which is a connected system to the lagoon estuarine system that is along the east coast of Florida, would protect the coral reefs, which are incredibly important resources to us. The Everglades wouldn't exist without the national park status.
Right.
Biscayne Bay would not be anywhere near as delightful as it is without Biscayne National Park, which took about 10 years to establish. And it took Dante Fasal pretty much full effort for about 10 years to get that done. I don't know whether a marine protected area under a national sanctuary would be more efficient than a national park. There's clearly going to be some administrative issues that come up will have to be dealt with.
This is something you're studying, though, with your organization, I take it, and right?
It's kind of a refreshing and different thought. I mean, I can't take any full ownership for it, but every once in a while, something that hadn't been talked about before comes up.
Right.
And it was actually during a conversation with some relatively famous lagoon scientists that this idea of protecting the biodiversity of the lagoon with a marine protected area that was nationally sanctioned sort of came up. And I think it has good merit.
Interesting. A lot of listeners maybe not know this, but the St. Louis Inlet was not a natural inlet,
Oh,
and it used to be down at Peck's Lake, and it wasn't much of an inlet
right.
then. But so the introduction of the inlet in St. Lucie, the St. Lucie Inlet, was a whole different change in the ecosystem when that happened.
Right.
I
But
I can remember being in an inner tube going around Sailfish Point when the tide came in when I was a child, and the beauty, the clams. We used to get clams. I mean, out there, it was just a beautiful environment. It was just it's beyond anything I can imagine right now.
there's probably something like 665 fish species that exist in the 10-mile area of the Indian River Lagoon.
Right.
The Bahamas maybe have 300. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, the diversity that is geographically present here is astounding.
What's one of the? Isn't it the most?
Well, I think there's some challenge to that because some of the migratory birds and some of the other migratory species are no longer coming here any
Right.
longer. So the numbers are down, but I don't know any place else that can equal that or can take that
Right.
sort of title away from us.
Right.
But that is, in my opinion, the treasure of the Treasure Coast.
Mhm.
This incredible diversity that is here and nowhere else. We have 9 different fish species that are here and nowhere
Right.
else, right?
And if it's deteriorating, we need to step up
Our
and
our
figure it out.
resilience as a species relies on the resilience of our ecosystem,
Right.
and that's directly related to the diversity of that ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
And if we fail to protect that, we lose.
I can remember when the nuclear power plant was being planned, and one of the thoughts was to bring ocean water in, and instead of pumping it back out into the ocean, because that's how they have their
Right.
coolant, right? We would pump it into the Indian River. And I was very young, and I had no idea what that effect would have been, but it sounded like a great idea. And I don't even know if it would have been a good or bad idea because
They're still talking about that up
Are
in the
they-
upper IRL,
are they
right?
really?
Where
Yeah.
where there's almost no exchange. If you look at the Barrier Island, every sort of western-facing bulge, sort of map view of the Barrier
Mhm.
Island, every western-facing bulge is actually the northern side of a previous inlet.
Oh,
And
I didn't know
so
that. Right.
there's been a lot of these. I mean, the Barrier Islands are very ephemeral. I mean, all of our beach restoration projects are very, very temporary.
Temporary is a good word.
So, nature is going to sculpt our coast, whether we like it or not.
Right,
And so
right.
some of these, we were talking about these engineered solutions to natural problems. They're
Usually doesn't
temporary.
work. Right.
So we're gonna replant the seagrass in the lagoon. We're going to reduce the nutrient loads. We are going to spend lots and lots of money to get it right.
Mhm.
We as citizens need to shepherd that. We
Mhm.
need to support it. We need to engage in it. We need to believe in it. And I think that optimism is something that we need to do. So
Well, let's talk about you're going to need some funds here. So let's
Yeah.
talk a little bit about your organization and what you're doing to
so
raise some money.
we quite honestly sort of went a little underground for several months so that we could regain our sort of status as a 501c3 and do some planning. And so our first fundraiser in my tenure as a keeper is going to be this weekend. We're having the Sand Spike Shootout, which is generally a pompano tournament, but
Mhm.
also whiting and some other surf fishing species. And that will be at Dolman Park.
Okay.
And
Excuse me, where's that?
Dolman Park is in St. Lucie County. It's about 4 miles north of the Martin County, St. Lucie County line. It's a beautiful park.
How do you register for such a thing?
You can go online to the Indian River Keeper website or Indian River Keeper FL at gmail.com and register on that website. We're also on April 2nd having a jazz brunch at the Driftwood Hotel in Jensen Beach. You can always get in touch with me on my cell phone, area code 772-341-4953. You can get us on Facebook at Indian River Keeper. You can communicate with me. I'm also currently the board chair and temporary executive director of the Marine Resources Council up in Brevard County.
Got your plate full.
Yes, this has been a very busy period of time in my life, but I want to be engaged. The IRL, the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program, is very engaged in the restoration projects. Florida Oceanographic is very engaged locally.
Mm-hmm.
Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute is very engaged in seagrass restoration and nurserying. The Discovery Center up in Brevard County, the Brevard Zoo, the Marine Resources Council. I'm sure I'm forgetting a few, but there are a lot of environmental organizations around that need your help, need your support, and please vote. And please contact your legislators about not only the bad bills, but the good bills.
And also let them know how important this system is, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Jim, most people don't think about that. They get on their boat, they go out, and they think it's going to be like, this is going to be nice forever.
Yeah.
And I think that it's deteriorating, and
Right.
but
You know,
we're hopeful that we can, put some things in place to protect it and get that graph going the other way.
You
right?
mentioned your boat, and I think that it's important because it's not one that's legislated, but recreational boating has an impact.
Sure.
The sandbars are no longer held together with seagrasses. And so as your boat wake washes up against that, the sediments are stirred up,
Mm-hmm.
and those sediments are loaded with nutrients. They're also clogging the ability for those plants to get sunlight. So please be mindful of your wake, be mindful of where you operate, stay in the channels, especially while this lagoon system is really in a fragile state.
And to contact your legislators and let them know how important the system is, right?
Yeah. Yep.
So next on your plate, you got quite a bit, and the 2 fundraisers coming up.
Yes. 2
And,
fundraisers.
Your website again?
Website is the email address is indianriverkeeperfl@gmail.com. Indian River Keeper is the website, indianriverkeeper.org. And you can contact me on my cell phone or my email address. I'd be happy to chat.
Well, we want to thank Jim Moir for all the work he does, and just please get in touch with this
Can
organization.
I mention one more
Sure.
thing? The Rivers Coalition is having its meeting next week at the Lock.
Oh,
so
good.
Please come. Please demonstrate that we do not need 350 CFS now, and that the C44 reservoir should be fully functional, and it's not.
Okay, great news. And thank you again, Jim, and thank you for all the work you do. Very important thing to our environment. Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you, Richard. Sorry about